Well, I have to say, when I was young, and that's quite some time ago, it was all about freedom and the end of the Cold War. I was an undergraduate student in Berlin, and when the wall came down, and when the challenge was how do we unite the existing western part with the eastern part, that was for me the moment where Europe really mattered. And to expand democracy, freedom, social justice, a compromise between collective decision-making as we had seen in the past, and then a reformed freedom, capitalism, the European social model, and trying to expand that to those who were deprived of those kind of opportunities. That was for me a very, very important European movement. And I had become European before when I lived in America, where I felt the difference. I had this very strong European identity, but when the wall came down, it was all overcoming the division of Europe. I felt very strongly that the people had called for something, and if we didn't have European citizens calling for reform, then we wouldn't have seen the movement. But you needed prudence on the side of the government, and you needed strong institutions that would embed the potential dangers of German unification into harmonious relations with neighbors. And I felt the drive came from the people, the desire to be free, but one needed prudent national government and one needed international institutions, including NATO, including the reform of the CSE into the OSCE, and the European Union as the anchor of what post-war cooperation in the western part of Europe had been, was an absolute important ingredient to stabilize the situation, because we weren't sure where it was going. What looked like a success story today, to some extent, with all the problems that we see, was a question of uncertainty. I think the institutions that we had built over time very much helped to stabilize the situation and provided some answers to the desires of the people who felt that the old regime in the East had to be overcome. The moment the wall came down, we had idealized narrative, both in the West as well as in Europe. And we thought we could just continue with this narrative and not understanding that alternative narratives, alternative perceptions, some illusions about what the West alone, what Europe alone could do, certainly came up very, very soon. And from then onwards, from this idealized version of Europe as the project of milk and honey and individual freedom and justice for everyone, and the West, globalization, individual standards, human rights, environmentalism spreading all over without really expecting the type of resistance and contestation that we see now, I think was the mood of the 1990s, but it shifted quite quickly. And I think we are now in the struggle of preserving what we feel excited about in Europe in a world which is rapidly changing and which provides a lot of avenues of contestation. I have always been an advocate of diversity and plurality, and we have so many European stories. And we have stories, individual national stories, we have stories from different classes, we have stories from different gender, religion, and so on. And they all have their narrative of Europe. The challenge is, how do we bind this into a common narrative which allows enough space for these different narratives, but unites Europe in one form or the other against something which we would consider to be a challenge to what holds Europe together. And I think plurality is necessary, but also trying to find something that binds all these different narratives from different angles within Europe and from outside Europe together in order to understand actually what constitutes Europe and what makes it worth preserving. Again, who is the EU? Are you talking about the institutions? Are you talking about EU citizens? Are you talking about the layers of governance that in a multi-level governance altogether constitutes the EU? Do you mean Brussels and so on? And I think when we say what does the EU do, how can they do it and so on, we need to understand that it is not the Commission alone, and it's not a new narrative of Europe stipulated by Brussels civil servants, but a new narrative of Europe has to bring all these perspectives together, and I would still argue this is the EU. EU is so diverse, but we need to understand that this is the EU. And then, of course, we need to understand that Europe is larger than the EU. And I would advocate writing, telling, thinking about reflecting European narratives which are not EU-centered. Because it's one of, as far as I can see, a development of social sciences in the last 20 years, that when we talk about Europe, we think the EU. And I think we have to break away from that EU-centered vision of Europe, even though I'm one of the biggest defenders of the EU as an institution, but it can't be the only anchor for a reference point for our stories about Europe.